Picture this. You're one of the most recognizable men on the planet. You've sent rockets to space, revolutionized the car industry, and your face is on magazine covers worldwide. But on this ordinary evening, you walk into a quiet restaurant just wanting to eat in peace, and your entire world shatters in an instant. Because sitting at a corner table, you see a woman you once loved more than life itself. The woman whose heart you broke years ago. And next to her are two little boys with piercing blue eyes that look exactly like yours did at their age. Children who move their hands the same way you do. Children who tilt their heads with the same curiosity that's driven you since childhood. Children whose very existence should be impossible. Your heart stops. Your hands shake. Because if what you're seeing is real, it means you're not just looking at strangers. You're looking at sons you never knew existed. And the woman who kept this secret? She's about to change your life forever with just 4 devastating words. If you want to know what those 4 words were and how they transformed one of the world's most powerful men into a father desperate for a second chance, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because this true story will leave you speechless. The evening air hung thick with humidity as Elon stepped through the glass doors of the small Thai restaurant on South Lamar. He had chosen this place deliberately. No paparazzi lurked in the shadows here. No investors waited to ambush him with pitches over pad Thai. Just the gentle hum of conversation and the comforting aroma of lemongrass and coconut milk. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans tonight. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed billionaire genius or space pioneer. Just a man seeking solitude after another 14-hour day of meetings, decisions, and the crushing weight of changing the world. Even so, a few heads turned as he walked past. That face, those sharp cheekbones, the way he carried himself with that particular blend of confidence and restless energy. It was unmistakable, even here in this modest corner of Austin. The hostess led him to a small table near the window, where the last rays of sunset painted everything in shades of amber and gold. He ordered his usual, red curry medium spice, though he always asked for mild. His stomach couldn't handle the fire it once could, not with the stress and the endless cups of coffee that fueled his days. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man who dreamed of colonizing Mars, defeated by Thai chilies. As he waited for his meal, Elon's eyes wandered across the restaurant's intimate dining room. Couples leaned over shared appetizers, their fingers intertwining across small tables. A group of college students laughed over steaming bowls of tom yum soup. Families with children who squirmed in their seats and asked endless questions about the strange new flavors dancing on their tongues. And then, in the far corner, partially hidden behind a decorative screen painted with golden temples, he saw them. A woman sat with her back to him, her auburn hair catching the warm light from the paper lanterns overhead. Something about the curve of her shoulders, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, soft and musical, a sound that seemed to reach across the years and grab him by the throat. 2 children sat across from her, identical twins with startling blue eyes and angular features that made his breath catch in his chest. The little boy was building something elaborate with his chopsticks and napkins, his face scrunched in concentration that Elon recognized like looking in a mirror. The girl watched her brother with patient amusement, occasionally reaching over to steady his creation when it threatened to topple. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, all sharp intelligence and restless energy, their eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that asked 1,000 questions before breakfast. Elon's curry arrived with a gentle clink of ceramic against wood, but he barely noticed. One of the twins, the boy, had looked up from his chopstick engineering project and was staring directly at him with those piercing blue eyes. Not the way children usually looked at strangers, with shyness or uncertainty. This was different. This was recognition, as if the child was seeing something familiar in a face he'd never encountered before. The woman must have noticed her son's distraction because she turned slightly, following his gaze. And in that moment, as her profile came into view, Elon felt the world tilt on its axis. Justine, his ex-wife, the mother of his older children. The woman who had once shared his dreams and his bed, who had loved him before the money and the fame and the weight of his ambitions had driven them apart. She looked older now, of course, they both did. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, a softness to her features that hadn't been there when they were young and hungry and convinced they could conquer the universe together. But it was unmistakably her. And those children. Elon's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. He had 5 sons with Justine, Nevada, who they had lost so young it still felt like an open wound, and then the twins and triplets who had filled their house with chaos and joy until everything fell apart. But these children were different, younger, and yet they carried his features like a signature written in bone and blood. The rational part of his mind, the part that built rockets and electric cars and dreamed of neural interfaces, insisted there had to be an explanation. A coincidence, some trick of lighting or wishful thinking, or the exhaustion that came from too many 18-hour days. But his heart, that treacherous organ he'd tried so hard to armor against disappointment, whispered something else entirely. He excused himself to the restroom, though what he really needed was air. Space. A moment to think without those blue eyes studying him like he was a puzzle to be solved. In the narrow hallway that led to the back of the restaurant, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. When had Justine moved to Austin? Why hadn't he known? And those children, God, those children who looked like tiny versions of himself, who carried his restless intelligence in their eyes and his stubborn curiosity in the set of their jaws. The questions multiplied like code compiling in his mind, each one spawning a dozen more, until the noise of his own thoughts threatened to drown out everything else. But underneath it all, running like a current through his confusion and shock, was something else entirely. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, absolutely terrifying hope. The last time Elon had spoken to Justine, Obama was still president, and electric cars were just a crazy dream that most people laughed at behind closed doors. It had been more than a decade since their paths had crossed, more than a decade since the lawyers had divided their life into neat categories of assets and custody arrangements, and who got which memories. Their divorce had been clinical, surgical really. No screaming matches or thrown dishes or dramatic scenes that would make good copy for the tabloids. Just 2 people who had loved each other once, signing papers in sterile conference rooms while their lawyers discussed visitation schedules and financial settlements in voices that could have been discussing the weather. It was almost worse than hatred, that cold efficiency. At least anger would have meant they still felt something. After the papers were signed and the dust settled, Justine had vanished from his world as completely as if she'd never existed. She'd avoided the cameras that followed his every move, stayed away from the galas and conferences where his new wives appeared on his arm like beautiful accessories. While his life became a public spectacle of rocket launches and Twitter controversies and red carpet appearances, she had chosen invisibility. Privacy. A life lived in the shadows of his spotlight. And now here she was in a modest Thai restaurant in Austin, looking more at peace than he'd ever seen her. There was something different about her face, something soft and settled that hadn't been there during their marriage. She moved with the unhurried grace of a woman who had found her rhythm, who wasn't rushing toward the next achievement or fleeing from the last disappointment. The children, God, the children. They couldn't be more than 5 years old, maybe 6 at the most. Still young enough to believe in magic and monsters under the bed, still innocent enough to build castles out of chopsticks and napkins without caring if anyone was watching. The timeline made his head spin. If they were his, if they were really his. He watched her gather their small jackets, help the little girl with her backpack, ruffle the boy's hair with the unconscious tenderness of a mother who had performed these rituals 1,000 times before. This version of Justine was foreign to him. During their marriage, she had been brilliant and ambitious, focused on her writing and her own dreams. Motherhood had been something they'd planned for someday, after the companies were established and the money was secure and they had time to properly love and raise the children they would bring into the world. But this Justine moved like motherhood was as natural to her as breathing. like she had been born for these quiet moments of patience and gentle correction and unconditional love. Elon's first instinct was to run, to slip out the back door and pretend this moment had never happened, to drive home to his empty mansion and lose himself in work until the memory faded into just another strange dream. It would be so much easier, so much safer. His life was complicated enough without ghosts from his past appearing with children who had his eyes. But his feet wouldn't move. Something deeper than curiosity kept him rooted to that spot, something that felt dangerously like destiny. He signaled the waiter and paid his bill without looking at the total, leaving a tip that was probably larger than most people's monthly salary. His hands moved automatically while his mind raced through calculations and possibilities and fears he didn't want to name. Then he positioned himself near the exit, trying to look casual while his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Justine stood and helped the children gather their things. The little girl had drawn something on her paper placemat, a house with a crooked chimney and stick figures that might have been a family. The boy was still clutching his chopstick creation, unwilling to abandon his architectural masterpiece even for the promise of dessert at home. As they walked toward the door, Elon stepped slightly into their path, not blocking their way, exactly, but making it impossible for her to pretend she hadn't seen him. Their eyes met, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, time simply stopped. He wasn't a billionaire in that instant. Not the CEO of multiple companies or the man who wanted to put humans on Mars. He was just Elon, the young man who had once believed that love and ambition could coexist, who had promised this woman forever and meant it with every fiber of his being. Justine, he said, and her name felt strange on his tongue. Familiar and foreign all at once, like a language he'd once been fluent in but hadn't spoken in years. She paused, and he saw something flicker across her face. Not shock exactly, more like resignation, as if she'd always known this moment would come eventually, in some restaurant or coffee shop or grocery store, when their carefully maintained distance would finally collapse. Elon, she replied, and the way she said his name made something deep in his chest ache. There was history in those two syllables. Years of shared laughter and bitter arguments and quiet moments in the dark when they'd whispered dreams to each other like prayers. The children looked up at him with those devastating blue eyes, studying his face with the intensity that children reserved for new puzzles. The little girl tucked herself slightly behind her mother's leg, not afraid but cautious. The boy continued to stare with that unsettling directness, as if he was trying to solve an equation written in Elon's features. "Are they yours?" The question escaped before he could stop it, blunt and desperate and completely lacking in the social graces that were supposed to govern these situations. Justine's breath caught, just for a moment. She looked down at the children, then back at him, and he saw her make some internal calculation. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "We need to talk." She reached into her purse and pulled out a pen, scribbled something on a napkin from a hostess station. Her handwriting was still the same, precise and slightly slanted, like she was always in a hurry to get her thoughts down before they escaped. She pressed the napkin into his hand, and for just a second, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was electric, familiar, and completely devastating. Then she was guiding the children toward the door, leaving him standing there with a piece of paper that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds and a heart that was beating so fast he wondered if this was what cardiac arrest felt like. The restaurant's air conditioning hummed around him. Other diners continued their conversations about weekend plans and work gossip and which movie they should see next Friday. The world kept turning, oblivious to the fact that his entire understanding of his life had just shifted on its axis. Elon walked to his car in silence, the napkin clutched in his fist, wondering if he was brave enough to make the call that would change everything. Before we go on, can I ask you something? Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story has reached. The drive home passed in absolute silence. No music, no podcasts, no phone calls from assistants with urgent updates about stock prices or launch schedules. Just the steady hum of his Tesla's electric motor and the endless loop of those two children's faces playing behind his closed eyelids every time he blinked. Elon had always been a man who lived in his head, who processed the world through calculations and projections and logical frameworks. But tonight, logic felt as useless as a broken compass. Those blue eyes haunted him, not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they were familiar in a way that made his chest tight with recognition. He remembered lying in bed with Justine years ago when they were still young and stupid and thought love could conquer the universe. She'd had her head on his chest, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin while they talked about the future in the way that couples do when forever still feels possible. They discussed children then. More children after the tragedy of Nevada and the blessing of their older boys. She'd wanted a daughter, he remembered, had dreamed of braiding hair and teaching her to code and watching her grow into the kind of woman who could change the world. But then the companies had grown bigger and his attention had scattered like buckshot across a dozen different projects, and somewhere in the chaos of building empires, they'd forgotten how to build a marriage. The conversations about more children had faded into arguments about time and priorities and whether success was worth the price they were paying for it. Now, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom at 3 in the morning, Elon tried to do the math. Those children couldn't be more than 5 or 6 years old, which meant they would have been conceived well after the divorce papers were signed. After Justine had disappeared from his life, and he convinced himself he was better off alone, married only to his work and his impossible dreams. But if they were his, how? The rational explanations came first, because that's how his mind worked. In vitro fertilization, stored genetic material. He'd participated in several research projects over the years, had contributed to studies on genetic preservation and fertility treatments. The idea of leaving behind a genetic legacy, of ensuring that human consciousness could survive beyond individual mortality, had always fascinated him. And then the memory hit him like a physical blow. The cryogenic preservation project. He'd almost forgotten about it, buried as it was under years of rocket launches and electric car production and neural interface development. But there had been a conversation, hadn't there? During one of their last good months together, before everything fell apart. Justine had been researching a book about fertility and genetics, and they talked about the ethics of genetic preservation, the possibilities, the implications. He'd agreed to participate in a research study, had provided samples for a fertility clinic that was working on long-term genetic storage. It had seemed like science fiction at the time, something that might matter decades in the future when space travel made genetic diversity a survival necessity. But Justine had been part of that research, had access to the facility, had known the protocols and the possibilities, and Elon sat up in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity, and he wasn't sure if he felt elated or terrified or some impossible combination of both. He spent the next day in meetings, but his mind was elsewhere. His assistant asked him 3 times about a decision regarding the Mars mission timeline, and each time he stared at her blankly until she repeated the question. The engineers presenting the latest battery technology might as well have been speaking in ancient Greek for all the attention he paid to their charts and projections. Finally, as the sun was setting over Austin, and his office had emptied of everyone except the security guards, Elon pulled out his phone and stared at the napkin with Justine's number. His fingers hovered over the screen for what felt like hours before he finally typed, "About yesterday, can we talk?" Her response came faster than he'd expected. "Moonrise Coffee. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone." He knew the place. A small coffee shop in South Austin that prided itself on fair trade beans and mismatched furniture, and the kind of studied casualness that appealed to artists and writers and people who wanted to disappear into the background noise of other people's conversations. It was exactly the kind of place Justine would choose, public enough to feel safe, private enough to speak freely. Elon arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality was one of the few things about himself he could still control. He ordered a black coffee he didn't want and chose a table in the corner where he could see the door but wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone walking in. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips, and he wondered when he'd become the kind of man who was nervous about a conversation with his ex-wife. Justine entered exactly at 2 o'clock because she'd always been punctual too. She wore jeans and a simple white blouse, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than her years. She moved through the coffee shop with quiet confidence, ignoring the few curious glances from other customers who might have recognized her as the woman who used to be married to that guy who shot cars into space. She slid into the chair across from him without ceremony, folding her hands on the scarred wooden table between them. No phones, no notebooks, no barriers except the weight of everything they never said to each other. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Really looked in a way they hadn't done in years. He saw the woman she'd become in the lines around her eyes and the confidence in her posture. She saw the boy he'd been underneath the billions and the fame and the crushing responsibility of trying to save the world. "They're yours," she said before the barista could bring her tea, before they could waste time on pleasantries or careful small talk or any of the social rituals that might have made this easier. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that, once crossed, would change everything forever. Elon felt something deep in his chest crack open, something he'd been keeping carefully locked away since the moment he'd first seen those impossible blue eyes staring back at him across a restaurant full of strangers. "I know," he whispered, though until that moment, he hadn't been sure he believed it. And just like that, his world shifted on its axis once again. The words hit Elon like a physical force, and for a moment the coffee shop seemed to tilt around him. The gentle murmur of other conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft jazz playing from speakers hidden in the exposed brick walls, it all faded into white noise as his brain struggled to process what she'd just told him. "How?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper, his voice lower and more vulnerable than it had been in years. Not the commanding tone of a CEO or the confident pitch of a visionary, but the raw question of a man whose world had just been turned inside out. Justine wrapped her hands around her teacup as if drawing warmth from a ceramic, though the Austin afternoon was warm enough to make the air conditioning hum constantly in the background. When she spoke, her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, like she was explaining a business decision rather than revealing the secret that had shaped her life for the past 6 years. "The embryos were created before our divorce was finalized," she said. "We talked about more children, remember? Before everything fell apart. The clinic had preserved several viable embryos as part of that fertility study you participated in." She paused, studying his face for some reaction he wasn't sure he could give. "After years of thinking about it, of wondering what those children might have been like, I decided to use them." The coffee in Elon's cup had gone cold, but he took a sip anyway, needing something to do with his hands while his mind raced through the implications. She'd made the decision alone, had carried his children, raised them, loved them, all without him knowing they existed. "It was my way of continuing something good from our marriage," Justine continued, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no accusation or anger. Just a quiet certainty that somehow made it worse. "Without needing you to be involved, without having to navigate your chaos or your schedules or your other priorities. Why didn't you tell me?" The question escaped before he could stop it, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to hear the answer. Justine met his eyes directly, unflinching. "Because it wasn't about you, Elon. It was about them. About giving them the best life I could, without the complications that would come from having the world's most famous workaholic as their father." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through what looked like hundreds of photos before finding the ones she wanted to show him. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like she was handling something precious and fragile. The first photo showed 2 toddlers building an elaborate tower out of wooden blocks, their faces scrunched in identical expressions of concentration. The second captured them at what looked like a science museum, one twin pointing excitedly at a display of planets while the other studied a complex mathematical equation on an interactive screen. "That's Oliver," she said, pointing to the boy who was mesmerized by the solar system display. "He asks me about stars and rockets and whether we'll ever live on other planets. He builds spaceships out of Legos and insists they have to be mathematically accurate for proper thrust ratios." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "He's 3 years old and already correcting my physics." "And Emma," she continued, indicating the little girl who was tracing the mathematical formula with her finger, "sees patterns in everything. Numbers, shapes, the way leaves fall from trees. She can solve puzzles that frustrate adults and build structures that shouldn't be able to stand but somehow do." Elon stared at the photos, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. They were unmistakably his children. He could see himself in every line of their faces, in the way they held their bodies, in that intense focus that had driven him since childhood. But they were also strangers, these little people who shared his DNA but not his life, who carried his gifts but none of his burdens. "Can I?" He started, then stopped, unsure how to ask for something he had no right to request. "Can I meet them?" Justine's hesitation was so brief, he might have imagined it, but he caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her features. "They don't know who you are," she said carefully. "I mean, they know you exist. It's impossible to live in the world and not know about Elon Musk. But they don't know you're their father." "I could be anyone," he said quickly, desperate not to lose this chance before he'd even had it. "A friend of yours. Someone you work with. I wouldn't say anything until you think they're ready. If you ever think they're ready." "I gave them my last name," Justine said, as if testing how he would react to this information. "Wilson. Oliver and Emma Wilson. They know they have a father somewhere, someone special who helped create them, but not who he is." Something cracked open in Elon's chest, a feeling so intense it was almost physical pain. Pride mixed with loss, joy tangled with grief, love for children he'd never met warring with anger at the years he'd already missed. They were his blood, his legacy, carrying his curiosity and intelligence into the world, but they were also complete strangers who would probably be happier never knowing the truth about their parentage. "I didn't include you," Justine said, her honesty as sharp as a blade, "because I didn't think you knew how to be a father to them. Not the kind of father they would need. You're brilliant, Elon, and you're changing the world in ways that matter. But you're also—" She searched for the right words. "You're consumed by your work in a way that doesn't leave room for anyone else. Not really. Not consistently." He should have been angry. Should have defended himself, argued about all the ways he'd been a good father to his other children despite his demanding schedule. Should have pointed out that she'd made this decision without consulting him, had stolen years of their lives from him without his knowledge or consent. Instead, he sat in silence because somewhere deep down he knew she was right. The drive home from a coffee shop was even quieter than the night before, but this time the silence was full of possibility rather than just confusion. He had children, twins who shared his fascination with the universe and his need to understand how everything worked. They were out there in the world, building rockets out of blocks and asking questions about distant planets, carrying pieces of his soul in their bright, curious eyes. But they were also strangers who might be better off staying that way. Children who had grown up happy and secure without him, who didn't need the chaos and pressure that came with being Elon Musk's offspring. As he pulled into his driveway, past the security gates and cameras that kept the world at bay, Elon realized that for the first time in years, he had a problem that couldn't be solved with engineering or innovation or throwing money at it until it went away. He had discovered he was a father. And now he had to figure out how to become one. The text arrived on a Thursday morning while Elon was reviewing the latest Starship design modifications. Just 7 words that made his hands tremble as he held the phone. "They want to meet you. Saturday, 3 p.m. He stared at the message for what felt like hours, reading it over and over until the words blurred together. They wanted to meet him. These children who carried half his DNA but none of his history, who built spaceships out of blocks and asked questions about distant worlds without knowing their father was the man trying to get humanity there. The nervous energy that followed was unlike anything he'd experienced since his first rocket launch. He'd stood before Congress defending electric vehicles, pitched impossible dreams to skeptical investors, watched billion-dollar rockets explode on launch pads, but none of that compared to the terror of meeting two 5-year-old children who might see through all his accomplishments to the father he'd never learned how to be. Zilker Park on a Saturday afternoon was exactly the kind of place Justine would choose: sprawling green lawns where children could run free, old oak trees that provided shade and privacy, far enough from the downtown crowds to feel peaceful, but public enough to feel safe. Elon arrived 20 minutes early because punctuality was still one of the few things he could control, and spent the time pacing near the designated playground like an expectant father outside a delivery room. When he saw them walking across the grass, his breath caught in his throat. The children were smaller than he'd expected from photos, more fragile somehow, with that ethereal quality that all young children possess before the world teaches them to be cautious. They walked on either side of Justine, each holding one of her hands, their free arms swinging backpacks and carrying treasures that were undoubtedly essential to their happiness. Noah, he could tell them apart now from Justine's descriptions, had dark hair that stuck up in the back despite obvious attempts to smooth it down, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Elias was slightly taller, his hair lighter, his movements more deliberate and thoughtful. They both wore the kind of clothes that spoke of a mother who cared more about their comfort than fashion: soft t-shirts and shorts that could survive grass stains and playground adventures. "Boys," Justine said when they reached the spot where Elon waited, his heart hammering so hard he was sure they could hear it. "This is Elon. He's a special friend of mine who builds rockets and cars that run on electricity instead of gas." The introduction was perfect, truthful without being overwhelming, impressive enough to capture their interest without raising questions she wasn't ready to answer. Elon knelt down to their eye level, a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. "Hi there," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Your mom told me you like to build things." Noah, the bolder of the two, stepped forward with the fearless curiosity that marked certain children as future explorers. "Are you the rocket man from TV?" he asked, his head tilted at an angle that was so familiar it made Elon's chest ache. "I guess I am," Elon replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Have you ever wanted to go to space?" "Every day," Noah exclaimed, his eyes lighting up with the kind of pure enthusiasm that adults spend their whole lives trying to recapture. "But Mama says we have to learn to drive cars first before we can drive rockets." Elias, quieter but no less intense, pulled a well-worn notebook from his backpack. "I drew you a spaceship," he said, offering the drawing with the solemnity of a diplomat presenting crucial documents. "It has extra engines for when Mars is really far away." Elon accepted the drawing with hands that shook slightly, studying the careful lines and surprisingly complex engineering concepts that this 5-year-old had somehow intuited. The ship had multiple stages, backup propulsion systems, and what looked like a detailed landing mechanism. It was the kind of design that showed not just imagination but real understanding of how things worked. "This is incredible," Elon said, and meant it. "You even included redundant systems for safety. That's exactly what we do with our real rockets." For the next hour, they talked about everything and nothing: whether chocolate was a suitable fuel for spaceships, why cars couldn't fly yet but probably would someday, and the logistics of growing gardens on Mars. The boys showed him their favorite climbing tree and taught him their version of tag, which involved complex rules about safe zones and rocket fuel stations that only made sense in the magnificent logic of childhood. When Justine produced a frisbee from her bag, suggesting they play catch, Elon felt a moment of panic. Sports had never been his strength. He was built for laboratories and computer screens, not athletic coordination. But as they formed a triangle on the grass, tossing the disc back and forth with varying degrees of success, something magical happened. He forgot to be nervous, forgot to analyze every word for its potential impact on his relationship with these children, forgot to worry about whether he was doing fatherhood correctly. He just played, laughing when Noah's enthusiastic throw sailed over his head, cheering when Elias made an impossible diving catch, feeling lighter than he had in years. Justine watched from a nearby bench, and when Elon caught her eye, he saw something in her expression that might have been hope, or maybe approval. Whatever it was, it made him stand a little straighter, throw the frisbee a little more confidently. As the afternoon wound down and the shadows grew longer under the oak trees, Elon found himself reluctant to let this perfect bubble of time end. "Maybe we could do this again sometime," he suggested, trying to sound casual despite the way his heart was racing. Justine didn't answer immediately, and he understood. This was a test, and the results were still being evaluated. He was being assessed not as a billionaire or a visionary, but as a man who might be trusted with the most precious things in her world. "We'll see," she said finally, which wasn't a no, but wasn't quite a yes either. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Noah suddenly broke away from his mother and ran back to Elon. Without warning or ceremony, he wrapped his small arms around Elon's waist in a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds but felt like a lifetime. "Thanks for playing with us, Rocket Man," Noah said, then skipped back to Justine as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Elon stood frozen for a moment, feeling the phantom warmth of small arms around his middle, the trust implied in that spontaneous gesture of affection. He managed to wave goodbye, to smile and promise he hoped to see them again soon, to walk to his car with something resembling composure. But the moment he was alone behind the wheel, the tears came. Not the frustrated tears of business setbacks or the angry tears of public criticism, but something deeper and more complicated. Grief for the years he'd missed, joy for the connection he'd just experienced, and a fierce, protective love for 2 little boys who had existed in his world for less than 2 hours, but had already changed everything. He sat in that parking lot until the sun set, holding a drawing of a spaceship and wondering if this was what it felt like to have your heart broken and healed at the same time. Something shifted in Elon's world after that afternoon in the park. Board meetings that once consumed his entire focus now felt like interruptions from what really mattered. He found himself declining speaking engagements, postponing factory visits, rearranging his entire universe so he could be in Austin more often. His assistants noticed the change, but were too professional to comment on their boss's sudden obsession with Texas real estate listings. The house he bought was modest by his standards, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a front porch and mature oak trees, nestled in the same quiet neighborhood where Justine had built her life with the boys. He told his real estate agent he needed a place to stay when visiting the Austin Gigafactory, which was technically true, but missed the real reason entirely. From the upstairs window, if he angled himself just right, he could see the corner where their street met the main road. He tried to be thoughtful with the gifts. Not the kind of extravagant presents that would raise questions or create obligations, but simple things that spoke to their interests. A junior chemistry set for each boy, complete with safe experiments and detailed instruction manuals. The kind of toys that fostered curiosity without screaming expensive or guilt purchase from an absent father. When Justine texted her thanks, her message came with a gentle warning. They love them, but remember, no exaggerations. They still don't know who you are to them. The weight of that anonymity settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was used to being recognized everywhere, to having his presence command attention and respect. But with Noah and Elias, he was just Elon, the rocket man who knew interesting things and showed up at their park sometimes. It was both liberating and heartbreaking, this chance to be loved for who he was rather than what he'd accomplished, coupled with the knowledge that he was lying to them every moment they spent together. The next invitation came 2 weeks later, a family picnic at Lake Austin, where he would continue playing the role of Mama's friend who builds cool stuff. He arrived with a cooler full of sandwiches and fruit, trying to look like someone who belonged in this ordinary scene of weekend family life. Elias had brought his latest Lego creation, a drone he'd constructed by combining 3 different kits in ways the manufacturer never intended. "Can we make it fly for real?" he asked Elon with the kind of faith that children reserve for adults they trust completely. They spent an hour in the grass, Elon explaining aerodynamics and battery placement while Elias absorbed every word with the intensity of a graduate student. When they finally achieved liftoff, 3 feet of wobbly, magnificent flight, Elias whooped with joy and threw his arms around Elon's neck as if he'd just witnessed magic. Meanwhile, Noah had discovered the small telescope Elon had brought, ostensibly for looking at boats on the lake, but secretly hoping for exactly this moment. "Why can't we see Mars?" Noah asked, squinting through the eyepiece with scientific determination. "It's daytime," Elon explained patiently. "But tonight, if your mom says it's okay, we could set this up in your backyard and I could show you Saturn's rings." The look Noah gave him was pure wonder, as if Elon had just offered to hand him the universe on a silver platter. Which in a way, he had. Justine watched these interactions from her spot on the picnic blanket, and Elon caught her studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not suspicion exactly, but careful evaluation. She was measuring something, his patience maybe, or his commitment to showing up consistently rather than just when it was convenient. Later, as they packed up the remnants of their impromptu family day, Elon found himself walking beside Justine while the boys ran ahead, chasing shadows and pretending to be astronauts exploring alien terrain. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice quieter than usual. She nodded, not looking at him, but not pulling away either. "Do you still hate me?" The question had been burning in his chest for weeks, ever since that first conversation in the coffee shop. He needed to know if the anger from their divorce still poisoned everything between them, if his presence in the boys' lives was something she tolerated rather than welcomed. Justine was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I don't hate you, Elon. I never really did. I just accepted that we're fundamentally different people who wanted different things from life. That doesn't make either of us wrong." Her words should have been reassuring, but somehow they made him feel more alone than outright hatred would have. Indifference was harder to fight than anger. The boys were getting more curious about him. Justine warned him during one of their carefully casual phone conversations. They asked why he knew so much about rockets and space and the things they loved most. Why he always seemed to understand their ideas before they finished explaining them. Why he looked at them sometimes like he was memorizing their faces. "I think it's time," Justine said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "They're smart kids. They're starting to put pieces together." "When you're ready," Elon replied, though every fiber of his being wanted to rush this revelation, to claim his place in their lives before another day passed. "When they're ready. I can wait." He started writing letters that night, long, rambling missives to each boy that tried to capture everything he wanted them to know about who he was and why he hadn't been there from the beginning. Letters that explained his dreams and his failures, his love for them, and his fear of being the kind of father they deserved. He sealed them in envelopes marked for later and locked them in his safe, hoping someday they would understand. The space gloves arrived the following week, child-sized replicas of the ones worn by astronauts, detailed and authentic, but without any identifying marks or signatures that would reveal their extraordinary cost. When he gave them to the boys during another park visit, their faces lit up like Christmas morning. "Now, we're real astronauts," Noah announced solemnly, pulling his gloves on with ceremony. "The realest," Elias agreed, already testing the grip by attempting to pick up rocks and leaves with his newly space-suited hands. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Justine called on a Thursday with an offer that made his heart race. "Would you like to take them somewhere? Just you and them. I have a work thing and they've been asking if they could spend more time learning about rockets." The planetarium at the University of Texas had a new show about Mars exploration, complete with immersive visuals and hands-on exhibits that let children pilot virtual spacecraft through the solar system. It was perfect, educational, exciting, and the kind of experience that would let him share his passion with them in a way that felt natural rather than forced. He picked them up at noon, both boys practically vibrating with excitement as they buckled into the back seat of his Tesla. They spent the entire drive asking questions about how the car worked, why it didn't make engine noise, and whether they could add rockets to it to make it fly. The planetarium was magical. They sat in the Dome Theater with their heads tilted back, watching stars wheel overhead while a narrator explained the challenges of interplanetary travel. When the show switched to a simulation of landing on Mars, Noah grabbed Elon's hand and squeezed tight, as if they were really descending through the Martian atmosphere together. In the interactive exhibit area, Elias mastered the spacecraft landing simulator, while Noah built model rockets and tested different fin configurations for maximum stability. They moved through the displays with the kind of focused enthusiasm that made other parents smile and comment on how lucky he was to have such curious kids. "Are we coming back here?" Noah asked as they walked to the car, his new space gloves still firmly in place despite the Texas heat. "Whenever you want," Elon promised, meaning it completely. "This was the best day of a whole year," Elias announced from the back seat as they drove home, his head pressed against the window as he watched the world go by. The best day of the year. Those words echoed in Elon's mind long after he'd dropped them off, long after he'd watched them run up the front steps to tell their mother about everything they'd seen and learned and experienced. He'd given them a few hours at a planetarium, and they'd given him something infinitely more valuable in return. They'd given him the chance to be their father, even if they didn't know that's what he was. Justine had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her mind, but sitting on the living room couch with both boys curled up beside her, their small bodies warm against hers, all her carefully planned words seemed to evaporate into the afternoon air that drifted through the open windows. She'd chosen this moment deliberately, after lunch when they were full and content, before the evening rush that would make them restless. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a neighbor mowing their lawn. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The backdrop of an ordinary Saturday that was about to become anything but ordinary. "Boys," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to tell you something important about our family." Noah looked up from the book he'd been reading, his attention immediately focused on her face with that intensity he'd inherited from his father. Elias set down the small robot he'd been adjusting, his movements careful and precise as he gave her his full attention. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this moment settle around them like a blanket. "Before you were born, back when you were just a dream that Mama had, there was a very special man who helped make that dream possible. Someone who loved the idea of you before you even existed." The boys waited with the patience that children show when they sense something momentous is coming, their eyes never leaving her face. "That man is Elon," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The friend who builds rockets and knows about space and teaches you about telescopes. He's not just Mama's friend. He's your father, your real biological father." The silence that followed felt infinite. Not the uncomfortable quiet of confusion or fear, but the deeper stillness of minds processing information that would change everything they thought they knew about their world. Noah was the first to speak, his voice smaller and more uncertain than usual. "So he's my actual dad? Like my real dad who made me?" "Yes, sweetheart. Both of you. He helped create both of you, and he loves you very much." Elias looked down at his hands, his brow furrowed in the way it got when he was working through a complex problem. Not frightened, but thoughtful. Processing this new information with the same methodical approach he brought to building his robots and solving puzzles. Justine reached for both their hands, her fingers intertwining with theirs in a gesture that had comforted them through scraped knees and bad dreams and all the small catastrophes of childhood. "I know this is a lot to understand. Do you have questions?" They sat in contemplative silence for several more minutes, and Justine marveled at their resilience, their ability to absorb this earth-shaking news without tears or tantrums. They were remarkable children, she realized, not just because of their intelligence or their curiosity, but because of their capacity to adapt and accept and love. That evening, when she called Elon to invite him to dinner, her hands shook as she dialed his number. "I told them," she said simply when he answered. "Can you come over tonight? They want to see you." The drive to their house felt like the longest 20 minutes of Elon's life. Every traffic light seemed to last forever, Every turn brought fresh waves of anxiety about how this evening might unfold. What if they were angry with him? What if they felt betrayed by all the months of pretending to be just a family friend? What if knowing the truth changed everything between them? He parked in the driveway he'd memorized from dozens of previous visits, but this time felt different. This time he wasn't arriving as Justine's friend who happened to know about rockets. He was arriving as their father with all the weight and responsibility and terrifying joy that title implied. The front door opened before he could knock, and there they were, Noah and Elias, looking at him with new eyes. Their gazes were more intense than usual, studying his face as if seeing it for the first time, searching for traces of themselves in his features. "Hi," Noah said, and there was something different in his voice. Not distant exactly, but careful. Measured. "Hi yourself," Elon replied, kneeling down to their eye level the way he always did, but knowing this simple gesture now carried new meaning. They moved through the evening ritual of dinner with unusual quiet, the boys asking fewer questions than normal while stealing glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. Justine had made spaghetti, their favorite, and the familiar routine of passing plates and wiping sauce from chins helped anchor them all in normalcy. It was Noah who finally broke the careful politeness. "Why didn't you live with us before?" he asked, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, marinara sauce dripping back onto his plate. The question was so direct, so innocent, that it took Elon's breath away. He could have given a complex explanation about custody arrangements and difficult divorces and the complicated logistics of adult relationships. Instead, he chose the simplest truth. "Because I didn't know you existed," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Your mama made you from a part of me that I'd given to help families have babies, but I didn't know she'd used it to create you too. I only found out a few months ago when I saw you at that restaurant." Elias looked up from his careful arrangement of pasta on his fork. "But now you know?" "Now I know, and I'm so happy I could cry." "Please don't cry in your spaghetti," Noah said with the practical wisdom of a 5-year-old, which made them all laugh and broke some of the tension that had been building throughout the meal. As they finished eating, Elias put down his fork and looked directly at Elon with those piercing blue eyes that were so familiar it sometimes took Elon's breath away. "Are you going to disappear again?" The question was asked without accusation, just the straightforward concern of a child who had learned that adults sometimes left and didn't come back. But it hit Elon like a physical blow, the idea that these boys might fear abandonment from yet another father figure. "Never," he said, and the word came out with more force than he'd intended. "I promise you, I will never disappear. I might have to travel sometimes for work, but I will always come back. I will always be your dad, even when I'm not in the same room." Justine felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she watched this exchange. There was something about the certainty in Elon's voice, the way he leaned forward to make sure the boys could see the truth in his eyes, that made her believe him completely. After dinner, as they settled into the evening routine of baths and pajamas and bedtime stories, Noah made an announcement that surprised them all. "Dad should tell us a story tonight," he said, the word dad rolling off his tongue as naturally as if he'd been saying it his whole life. Elon's throat tightened with emotion, but he managed to nod. "What kind of story would you like?" "About space," Elias said immediately. "But make it up. Don't just tell us real stuff." So Elon found himself sitting on the edge of their shared bed, one boy tucked under each arm, inventing a tale about 2 brothers who lived on Mars and discovered that the red planet wasn't empty after all, but filled with friendly creatures who had been waiting centuries for human children to come and play with them. The boys listened with sleepy attention, occasionally interjecting questions or suggestions that Elon wove seamlessly into the narrative. By the time the Martian brothers had made friends with a family of crystal beings who lived in underground cities, both Noah and Elias were fighting to keep their eyes open. From the doorway, Justine watched this scene unfold with wonder. The 3 of them together, Elon's dark head bent over their lighter ones, his voice soft and warm in the lamplight, the boys' complete trust evident in the way they relaxed against him, looked like something that had always existed. like a family that had been waiting to recognize itself. For the first time since she'd made the decision to use those preserved embryos, Justine felt complete peace with her choice. Not because Elon was wealthy or famous or could give the boys opportunities she couldn't provide alone, but because of this moment, because of the way he held them like they were precious, told them stories like their dreams mattered, and looked at them like they were the best thing that had ever happened to him. They were a family now, strange and unconventional, and born from choices that had taken years to resolve, but real nonetheless. And as she watched her boys drift off to sleep in their father's arms, Justine knew that some stories were worth waiting for the right ending. The photograph was innocuous enough. A man pushing two children on swings at a neighborhood park, golden afternoon light filtering through oak trees, the kind of scene that played out in thousands of parks across America every day. But when that man happened to be Elon Musk, and when those children bore an unmistakable resemblance to him, innocuous became explosive. The paparazzi photographer had been lurking behind a cluster of trees, probably hoping to catch Elon doing something scandalous or newsworthy. Instead, he'd captured something far more valuable, a tender moment between a father and his sons. Noah's face lit with pure joy as Elon pushed his swing higher, Elias waiting patiently for his turn while building something elaborate in the sandbox nearby. Within 3 hours, the image was everywhere. Twitter exploded with speculation. Instagram buzzed with theories. News websites scrambled to confirm what seemed obvious to anyone with eyes, that Elon Musk had children the world had never known about. Justine first learned about it from a text message from her sister. Turn on the news. Now. She stood in her kitchen, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, watching her peaceful life disintegrate in real time on the television screen. The photo filled the frame, while talking heads speculated about secret relationships and hidden families, and whether this revelation would affect Tesla's stock price. Her phone started ringing before the news segment ended. Unknown numbers with area codes from New York and Los Angeles and London. Reporters who had somehow obtained her personal information, all wanting exclusive interviews about her secret children with the world's richest man. When Elon called 20 minutes later, his voice was heavy with guilt and fury. "I'm so sorry, Justine. I should have been more careful. I should have seen the photographer." "How?" she asked, though she wasn't really angry with him. Not yet. She was still in shock, still processing the fact that their carefully constructed privacy had been shattered by a telephoto lens and the internet's insatiable hunger for celebrity gossip. "I don't know, but I should have protected them better." By evening, news vans had appeared outside the boys' elementary school. Reporters with cameras and microphones lingered near the playground where Noah and Elias had spent countless happy hours, transforming their sanctuary into a circus. The principal called to discuss security measures and media management, words that had never belonged in conversations about 5-year-old children. Elon's legal team moved with swift efficiency, sending cease and desist letters to the most aggressive publications and filing restraining orders against photographers who came too close to the school. But the damage was already spreading, viral and uncontainable. The official statement came 48 hours later, posted simultaneously on all of Elon's social media accounts and distributed to major news outlets. It was characteristically direct, without the corporate polish his PR team usually insisted upon. "Noah and Elias are my sons. They deserve to grow up as normal children, not as subjects of public speculation. Any media outlet or individual who photographs, follows, or attempts to interview them will face the full force of legal action. Their childhood is not your content." The statement was vintage Elon, blunt, protective, and completely uninterested in managing public opinion. It surprised many who expected a more polished response, but for those who knew him well, it was perfectly in character. When it came to protecting the people he loved, diplomacy took a back seat to direct action. Most reputable news organizations respected the boundary he'd drawn. The major networks pulled back, focusing their coverage on the business implications rather than the children themselves. But the tabloids and gossip blogs continued circling like vultures, hungry for any scrap of information about the mysterious boys who had appeared so suddenly in their target's life. Justine made the decision to leave town that weekend, packing the boys into her car for what she told them was a surprise adventure to visit their aunt in San Antonio. But really it was a retreat, a chance to breathe without cameras tracking their every movement, to let the boys play without worrying about telephoto lenses capturing their faces. Elon drove down to join them on Sunday, taking back roads and switching cars twice to avoid detection. He found them at a small park near Justine's sister's house, the boys chasing each other around playground equipment while Justine watched from a bench, her sunglasses hiding eyes that looked tired and strained. "I feel so helpless," he confessed as they walked while the boys played, their conversation conducted in the low voices of parents trying not to let their children hear their worry. "I've built companies and launched rockets and convinced the world to buy electric cars, but I can't protect my own sons from photographers." "We'll figure it out," Justine said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "Maybe homeschooling. Maybe a private school with better security. Maybe we move somewhere more remote." It was Noah who broke through their adult anxiety with the clarity that children bring to complex situations. That evening, as Elon helped him with a puzzle, the little boy looked up with those blue eyes that had become so precious and asked, "Dad, do I have to talk to the people with cameras?" "Never," Elon said immediately, pulling his son closer. "You never have to talk to anyone you don't want to talk to. You just get to be a kid. That's your only job." "Good," Noah said, returning his attention to the puzzle with the satisfied air of someone whose biggest concern had just been resolved. "Because I don't want to be on TV. I want to build rockets." The conversation about schooling continued over the following days, conducted in phone calls between Austin and San Antonio as they tried to construct a life that would protect the boys without isolating them completely. Elon suggested hiring private tutors, creating a learning environment that could travel with them when necessary. Justine worried about socialization, about depriving them of the normal childhood experiences she'd worked so hard to provide. Gradually, as they navigated this new reality together, something unexpected began to happen. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their peace actually brought them closer together. Late-night phone calls about security measures evolved into longer conversations about the boys' personalities and needs. Coordinating their protection required a level of cooperation and communication they hadn't shared since the early days of their marriage. They were becoming partners again. Not romantic partners, but allies united in the fierce love they both felt for Noah and Elias. The boys seemed to sense this shift in their parents' relationship. Their drawings, which had always featured stick figures of themselves and Mama, now included a tall figure with dark hair standing beside them. When Justine asked Noah about one particularly detailed crayon masterpiece, he explained matter-of-factly, "That's our family. You and Dad and me and Elias." Looking at that drawing, for figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, a house with a crooked chimney in the background, and what appeared to be a rocket ship parked in the yard, Justine felt something settle in her chest. Not the romantic love she'd once felt for Elon, but something deeper and more lasting. The recognition that they were bound together now not just by their shared past, but by their shared future as parents to these remarkable children. The world might have discovered their secret, but in doing so, it had also helped them discover something they hadn't expected to find. That love could take many forms, and that family wasn't just about the people you lived with, but about the people you would move heaven and earth to protect. In Noah's drawing, they were all smiling. And for the first time since that photograph had changed everything, Justine thought that maybe, eventually, that might actually be true. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the rest of Austin slept and even his phone remained mercifully silent, Elon found himself thinking about children. All the children he'd brought into this world, and the one he'd lost before ever really knowing him. Nevada. The name still hit him like a physical blow, even after all these years. His first son with Justine, taken by SIDS at just 10 weeks old. They'd found him in his crib on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and in that moment, Elon had learned that all his intelligence and ambition and determination meant nothing when faced with the fundamental fragility of life. He'd handled Nevada's death badly, thrown himself into work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun grief, as if building companies and launching rockets could somehow balance the cosmic equation that had stolen his son. Justine had needed to grieve together, but he needed to build something, anything, to prove that creation could triumph over loss. Maybe that's where they'd started to break apart, in the space between her need to feel everything and his need to feel nothing at all. Now, sitting in his study, surrounded by models of rockets that would carry humanity to Mars, he wondered if those coping mechanisms had cost him more than just his marriage. How many moments with his other children had he missed while buried in emails and blueprints and the endless pursuit of changing the world? How many bedtime stories had he skipped for conference calls? How many soccer games had he attended in body but not in spirit, his mind already racing ahead to the next impossible project? The journal Justine brought him that afternoon was weathered and soft, its pages filled with her careful handwriting from years past. She'd found it while cleaning out old boxes, she explained, and thought he might want to see what she'd written during the months when she was considering using their preserved embryos. "I don't have to read it if it's too personal," he said, though his hands were already opening the cover with the careful reverence reserved for sacred texts. "I want you to," she replied simply. "I think you need to understand why I made the choice I did." The entries were dated, spanning nearly 2 years of internal debate and quiet longing. He found the passage she'd marked with a yellow sticky note, written in her neat script 3 years before Noah and Elias were born. "I dreamed about twins again last night. 2 little boys with E's eyes and my stubborn streak, building impossible things in the backyard while I watched from the kitchen window. I know it's crazy to even consider using the embryos after all this time, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something unfinished between us. Not romantic, that ship has sailed, but something deeper. Like we started something beautiful together and never got to see how the story ended." Elon's throat tightened as he read her words, understanding for the first time that the boys weren't just her way of becoming a mother again, but her way of healing something that had been broken between them years ago. "When I watch you with them now," Justine said softly, settling beside him on the park bench where they'd agreed to meet, "I see the father you always could have been. The one who gets lost sometimes in all your big dreams, but who's there when it really matters." They walked the familiar paths of Zilker Park as they talked, their feet finding a comfortable rhythm that didn't require conscious thought. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that shifted and danced with each breath of wind. "Have you forgiven me?" Elon asked finally, the question that had been burning in his chest for months. "For not being the husband you needed? For not being present enough when we had the chance?" Justine was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on a family playing frisbee in the distance. When she spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "I think forgiveness was my way of moving forward. I had to let go of the anger to make room for everything else, for Noah and Elias, for the possibility of us being friends again, for the chance that you might be the father they deserve." "I want to be," he said, and his voice cracked slightly with the weight of that admission. "I want to be the father I wasn't able to be before. I want to show up for them in ways I didn't know how to show up for anyone." They paused near the playground where they'd first reconnected with the boys months ago, watching other children swing and climb and imagine themselves into adventures. It was here that everything had changed, where the trajectory of their lives had shifted in ways none of them could have predicted. "I don't want them to be defined by my name," Elon said suddenly. "I don't want the burden of being Elon Musk's sons to limit who they become or what they choose to do with their lives." Justine smiled, the first truly peaceful expression he'd seen on her face in years. "Then let them choose who they want to be. Support whatever that looks like, even if it's not what you would have chosen for them." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. He'd built his entire life around the premise that he could shape the future through sheer force of will and relentless work. But these boys would have to write their own stories, and his job would be to love them through whatever those stories became. That evening, when he stopped by for dinner, Noah looked up from his drawing with the casual curiosity that marked all his questions. "Dad, can we see where you build a rocket sometime?" "We want to see the real ones," Elias added, not looking up from the elaborate Lego spaceship he was constructing. "Not just pictures." Elon felt his heart skip a beat. A tour of SpaceX had been something he'd dreamed of sharing with them, but he'd been afraid to suggest it, worried about seeming too eager or overwhelming them with the scale of his ambitions. "Would you like that? A private tour just for you two?" "Yes," they said in unison, their faces lighting up with the kind of pure excitement that made all his years of work suddenly feel worthwhile. As he helped them get ready for bed that night, brushing their teeth and listening to their chatter about rockets and Mars and whether aliens might be friendly, Elon found himself imagining something he hadn't dared to picture before: Christmas morning. All of them together in one house, the boys tearing through wrapping paper while Justine made coffee, and he pretended to be surprised by gifts he'd carefully selected months in advance. That could happen, Justine said when he shared this tentative hope with her as they stood in the hallway outside the boys' room. "But only if you don't disappear on us again. Only if you prove that showing up consistently matters more to you than any board meeting or product launch." He wanted to promise her that nothing would ever take priority over these children again, but he'd made promises before that his ambition had ultimately broken. Instead, he reached for her hand, not with romantic intent, but with the quiet certainty of someone making a covenant. "I'm here," he said simply. "For as long as you'll let me be, I'm here." Her fingers intertwined with his, and for a moment they stood together in the soft light of a hallway, listening to their son's quiet breathing through the partially open door. They weren't lovers anymore, and they might never be friends in the uncomplicated way they'd once been. But they were something more important now. They were family, scarred and imperfect and built from the pieces of what they'd lost, but real nonetheless. And sometimes Elon thought, as he squeezed Justine's hand gently before letting go, the most beautiful things were the ones that had been broken and carefully put back together with love. Time moved differently now, measured not in quarterly earnings reports or rocket launch schedules, but in soccer practices and bedtime stories and the gradual accumulation of small, perfect moments that build a life worth living. Elon had restructured his entire existence around Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, Saturday morning adventures, and Sunday dinners that stretched long into the evening, while Noah and Elias peppered him with questions about everything from black holes to why ice cream melted, and whether they could build a robot that would do their homework. His assistants learned to protect these hours as fiercely as they'd once guarded board meetings, understanding that canceling dinner with the boys was simply not an option, regardless of what crisis might be unfolding in the corporate world. The space stories had started as a bedtime ritual but evolved into something more elaborate, a handwritten notebook filled with adventures featuring two young explorers who traveled between planets, solving problems with ingenuity and kindness. Elon found himself carrying the notebook everywhere, adding new chapters during flights between cities, sketching illustrations in the margins while waiting for meetings to start. It was the most important work he'd done in years, even though no one would ever read it except two 5-year-old boys who thought their father hung the moon. Justine had begun writing again, not the academic papers that had once consumed her attention, but something softer and more personal. She'd found her voice again in the quiet moments between her children's questions, capturing the poetry of ordinary life in a house where rockets were built from cardboard boxes and the kitchen table served as mission control for imaginary journeys to distant worlds. The elementary school science fair arrived with the fanfare that such events generate in the lives of parents whose children have spent weeks perfecting projects that will probably collapse the moment they're transported to the gymnasium. But Noah and Elias had approached their assignments with the methodical intensity they'd inherited from both sides of their genetic lineage, and their enthusiasm was infectious enough to make even Elon nervous as he took his seat in the back row of folding chairs. He'd wanted to help, of course, had offered access to engineers and equipment and resources that could have transformed their simple school projects into something extraordinary. But Justine had gently but firmly declined, explaining that this was about the boys learning to solve problems with their own hands and minds, not about impressing judges with technology they hadn't built themselves. So he sat with the other parents, a billionaire in jeans and a faded t-shirt, his hands folded in his lap, and his heart hammering with pride as he watched his sons prepare to share their work with the world. Elias had constructed a working model of a solar power system, complete with tiny LED lights that glowed when positioned under the gymnasium's fluorescent fixtures. His presentation was careful and thoughtful, explaining how sunlight could be captured and converted into electricity with the patience of someone who truly understood the science behind his creation rather than simply memorizing facts. Noah's rocket project was more ambitious, a detailed scale model complete with removable stages and a recovery system that deployed a small parachute. When he launched it across the gymnasium floor using a compressed air system he designed himself, the crowd of parents and teachers broke into spontaneous applause as the parachute deployed perfectly and the rocket landed softly near the judges' table. Both boys won first place in their respective categories, and as they stood on the small makeshift stage holding their ribbons and beaming with the joy that comes from being recognized for work that mattered to them, Elon felt tears run down his cheeks without shame or embarrassment. Justine found him in the crowd afterward, her own eyes bright with emotion, and without words or hesitation, she stepped into his arms. Not as a former lover or a current co-parent, but as someone who understood that some moments were too big for one person to hold alone. They stood together while their sons chattered excitedly with classmates, accepting congratulations from other parents who had no idea they were witnessing a family discovering itself. "Ice cream," Noah announced as they walked to their cars, his ribbon still pinned to his shirt like a medal of honor. "We have to celebrate with ice cream." It's tradition. Elias agreed with the seriousness of someone establishing constitutional law. The ice cream shop was one of those local places that had survived decades of corporate competition by serving portions that were generous and flavors that were impossibly creative. They found a table outside, under string lights that twinkled in the early evening air, and ordered combinations that would have horrified nutritionists but delighted children everywhere. They were laughing about something. Elon couldn't remember what later, when an elderly woman approached their table with the kind of smile that grandmothers wear when they see children being loved well. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle and warm. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but your grandsons are just delightful. You must be so proud." The assumption was natural enough. Elon's hair was graying at the temples, and the age difference between him and the boys could easily have suggested a generational gap. But her words hit him with unexpected force, not because they were incorrect, but because they reminded him how much time he'd already missed and how grateful he was for the time he had now. "Actually," he said, his voice softer than usual, "they're not my grandsons. They're my future colleagues." The woman looked confused until Noah and Elias dissolved into giggles, launching themselves at Elon with the kind of spontaneous affection that children reserve for people who understand their jokes. He caught them both in a hug that lifted them off their feet, spinning them around while they shrieked with laughter, and Justine grabbed her phone to capture the moment. She posted the photo later that night, not because she wanted attention or validation, but because the image perfectly captured something that had taken months to build and might take years to fully understand. The caption was simple: "Family is where time decides to begin again." By morning, the photo had spread across social media with a gentleness that surprised them all. Instead of the invasive speculation that had marked their first exposure to public attention, the responses were warm and respectful. Comments from other parents about the beauty of second chances, messages from people who understood that love could take many forms and that family was something you created rather than something you were simply born into. One headline captured the sentiment that seemed to resonate most widely: Elon Musk, the father who almost wasn't but chose to be. Justine had the photo printed and framed, hanging it in the living room where it would catch the morning light and remind them all of the moment when their unlikely family had been recognized and celebrated by the world. Underneath, in her careful handwriting, she added the words that had become their unofficial motto: "Family is where time decides to begin again." Looking at that photograph now, Elon could see their entire journey reflected in a single moment. The years of separation and silence, the accidental reunion in a Thai restaurant that had changed everything, the careful building of trust and love, and the kind of commitment that couldn't be broken by distance or disagreement. They weren't a traditional family. They might never be. But they were something more important. They were chosen. Every day, with every decision to show up and be present and put these children first, they were choosing each other anew. And in the end, Elon thought as he watched Noah and Elias build their latest rocket ship from couch cushions and determination, that choice was the most powerful force in the universe. More revolutionary than electric cars, more ambitious than Mars colonization, more important than any company he'd ever built. It was the choice to love consistently and without condition in a place called now. And there you have it, a story that proves love doesn't follow timelines or rulebooks. Sometimes the greatest gifts in our lives come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, delivered by the very people we thought we'd lost forever. Elon Musk had conquered space, revolutionized transportation, and built an empire, but it took two 5-year-old boys to teach him that the most important mission of his life wasn't reaching Mars. It was simply showing up consistently and completely for the people who needed him most. Ask yourself this: if you discovered children you never knew existed, would you have the courage to start over? Would you be brave enough to admit your failures and patient enough to earn their trust, one bedtime story at a time? And perhaps most importantly, would you choose love over pride, presence over perfection? Because that's exactly what this story challenges all of us to do, to believe that it's never too late to become the person someone else needs us to be. This isn't just Elon's story. It's a reminder that second chances don't have expiration dates, that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the family we're meant to have finds us when we're not even looking for it. Take a moment to think about the people in your own life who might be waiting for you to choose them, consistently and without condition. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories about love, redemption, and the beautiful mess we call family. Your support means everything.